For the test, right?
All right. Can we get started here? All right, let's go. All right. Last time we began to look at the history of Asia, and we saw that when we talk about Asian history, contemporary with early modern Europe, it's called late traditional Asia. And that label is used by historians because in Asia, in many ways, there was a continuation and preservation of the past to a greater degree than moving in a new direction like we see so much in early modern Europe, where a whole new society was kind of evolving and emerging. In Asia, there was still a lot of change, of course. Change always happens, but it was also societies were trying to preserve and maintain institutions and ideas that had been around for centuries. We saw that in Japan, where the Tokugawa shogunate really tried to freeze society in a way, kind of take a snapshot of society and maintain that by whatever means necessary. And when we start talking about India, in the history of India, the history in this period is kind of like a rerun of historical traditions and developments in India, where you see a people from north of India, from the steppes, crossing over the Himalayas and invading and settling within the Indian subcontinent. And that was certainly true in this period. So today we're going to focus on the history of India and Central Asia, and we're also going to look at Iran in Western Asia or Central Asia. And the theme of this discussion would be on some of the great Islamic empires. The late traditional Asia period saw a number of dynasties that established in Asia and Central Asia and in India that were very much trying to preserve Islam in the same way that the Ming and Manchu dynasty preserved ancient traditions in China, and Tokugawa tried to do that in Japan. The states of Asia, of Central Asia, that were Islamic and did whatever they could to preserve the traditions of Islam that went back, of course, to the origins of Islam in the 7th century AD. So that's what we're going to look at today. Now, when we last left India, we were talking about how in Central Asia you had this tradition of these tribes living in the steppe. Remember, the steppe is this big open plain where most of the people are herdsmen. You know, they live on the horses, they raise cattle and sheep, they live in tents, and they're organized by tribes. They don't have cities, or they're not. They're more of a simple as opposed to a complex culture. But every once in a while, since these horsemen are great warriors and very good at being cavalrymen, you would see a bunch of tribes coalesce into a powerful force, and you'd see the emergence of strong states. So in the history of the steppe, here and now, here and there, you see the emergence of powerful leaders who are able to establish states. One of the biggest example early on would be like Genghis Khan in Mongolia, and Timur the Lame in what is today Uzbekistan. Now, by about the time we get to by around 1500, though, the scope and the breadth of these empires had been contained to a large degree because of the fact that guns had been introduced to Asia. Now, see, the great advantage of the horsemen had been their ability to fire arrows while they were riding a horse. Now, that's a pretty amazing feat. I don't know if any of you here ride horses, but can you imagine being able to like ride a horse, not even hold on to the reins, have a bow and arrow, and shoot a bow and arrow rapidly and accurately? I mean, I don't think anybody in this room could do that. I don't think very many people could do that, unless you lived on your horse from the time you were 3 years old and lived on a horse, and a horse was an extension of yourself. Then maybe, and you shot arrows a lot and did a lot of, practice with your warfare. Then you might be able to do that. Now, the horsemen of the steppe had that advantage. They lived on their horses their whole lives, and they could shoot arrows and position their horses. And these horsemen in mass were an incredible military force. but that was all neutralized to a large degree by guns. With the introduction of muskets, now the infantrymen had the advantage over the horsemen in battle. So you could still have, after the introduction of guns to Central Asia, you could still have powerful leaders who could organize a state, but they could not have nearly the success that a Genghis Khan or the Timur the Lame Tamerlane could have in amassing a massive empire. There were just limits to where they could do, because now guns had entered the picture and had changed the nature of warfare. Now, in around 1500, now the Uzbeks are a people of the steppe who are of mixed Turkish and Mongol language. They're a Turco-Mongol mix, so to speak. And around 1500, they had established a state. Now, a Khan is a name for a. Well, I don't know what this is. Oh, maybe I need to tag it or something. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. Well, now it's not working. I don't know what I need to do, but I'm not going to work. All right. Now, a Khan, on this point, a Khan is the name of a ruler among the Turks and the Mongols. So an Uzbek had established a state in what is roughly now Uzbekistan. If you look at a map of Asia here, you can Uzbekistan. I wish I could show it to you. Uzbekistan is right up in here in this area. This is all the steppe here. This area right here, southern Russia, Kazakhstan. This whole area is steppe. And the Uzbeks, and here's Pakistan, here's Afghanistan, and the Uzbek Khanate was established right in this area around 1500. Now, how does that figure in the history of India? Well, the establishment of the Uzbeks put a pressure on another group of tribes named the Chagatai Turkomen. It was a Turkish people. Do you have a question or you just read? No. Oh, okay. Now the Sultan or leader or Khan, whatever, of the Chagatai Turkoman was a man named Babur, kind of like the elephant in the little children's stories. Now Babur, he was the commander of the Chagatai Turkoman, and his family carried a lot of weight among the tribesmen, because he was supposedly descended from both Genghis Khan and from Tamerlane, Timur the Lame. So he had distinguished ancestry, and he was the leader of the Chagatai Turkoman, and he did not want to be ruled by the Uzbeks. He did not want to be ruled by these people. So he decided to take his army, and he decided to march south and invade what is today Afghanistan. So he marched into Afghanistan, and then after he marched in Afghanistan, he crossed over the Himalayas, the mountain passes, into what is today Pakistan and into India. And his goal was to capture Delhi. Now, Delhi in central India was the capital of what was called the Delhi Sultanate. Now, this was a state, the most powerful state in India at the time, in at least northern and central India. And it had been established several centuries earlier by another group of invaders. Now, and I mention this because we're in the middle of fighting a war in Afghanistan. There are people who live in Afghanistan and Pakistan. They live in the mountains, and they're called Pashtuns. And they've been around living in those parts since about the 6th or 7th century A.D. Now, the Pashtuns were Muslims. They were tribesmen. And back in 1200, they're very warlike. They make up the bulk of the Taliban, both of Pakistan and Afghanistan. All of them. And their tradition, they live to fight wars and to kill people. I mean, that's what they do. If you're a man, you fight. That's what you do. From your day you're raised up, you fight wars. You fight rival tribes. You fight whoever there's to fight. You fight. That's how you bring glory to your family. Now, these Pashtun warriors had combined with some Turks back in 1200, and they had set themselves up in Delhi, in central India. Now, they had been around there for a couple of hundred years, and they had established an empire where they had forced native Indian peoples to pay them tribute. So they were the established force in India. And it was the goal of Babur that he was going to lead this new army of Turkoman, and they were going to get in there and they were going to take over Delhi and replace that sultanate. Now, Babur, when he invaded, he had some horsemen, of course. They always have horsemen. But he mainly had guns. And in fact, people have referred to the empire of Babur as a gunpowder empire because he was an innovator and he was using this new technology of guns and gunpowder to defeat his rivals and to win the day and to build an empire. So he marched his armies and he succeeded. He defeated the sultans of Delhi, defeated these and replaced them. And so now Delhi became the capital of a new empire, a new state that now dominated what would be central India, Pakistan, and Afghanistan. So it was a significantly large state established by Babur. And when he established his empire, he engaged in the same policies as the preceding empire. Throughout India, you would find these little princely Hindu states. Now, the Hindus are Hindus, they're not Muslims. And the rulers of these states were called Rajputs. And there are a bunch of them. And what he would do was that these Rajputs, these Hindus and these little princely states, they would be allowed to have a certain amount of autonomy in exchange for paying a heavy tribute to Babur. You know, they'd formerly paid tribute to the Sultan of Delhi. Now they paid tribute to the new empire of Babur. Now, this new empire, this new dynasty that had established themselves in central and northern India and Pakistan and all that area became known as the Mughal dynasty. It was established by about 1530 by Babur, and it was called the Mughal dynasty because Mughal is a corruption of the word Mongol, and Babur, who founded this dynasty, claimed to be descended from Genghis Khan. So that was why this empire became known as the Mughal dynasty, the successors of Babur ruling over India. Now, this empire that was established followed the same policies that had been followed by the Delhi Sultan. This is how it worked. All across India, if you were converted to Islam, you were cool. That was great. Now, if you did not convert to Islam and decided to remain a Hindu, then you had to pay a very, very heavy tax. Period. And also you were a second-class citizen. Now, we know for a fact that millions upon millions of Indians converted to Islam to avoid paying these very heavy taxes. And I'm sure some converted for spiritual reasons. Maybe they found Islam to be a more fulfilling religion than their native Hindu religion, but who knows? But in fact, to this day in India has one of the largest Muslim populations in the world, even though it's not a Muslim country. Well, I guess when you have over 1 billion people living in India today and you have 200-some million Muslims, they're still a minority, even though there's more than 200 million of them. But anyway, but billions of Hindus did convert to Islam. So it was an Islamic state ruled by Muslims, but there were the majority of people continued to be Hindu and continued to practice their traditional religion and pay the very heavy tax that they were required to pay under this system. Now, when Babur established his empire, you see, a very interesting case. He spoke Turkish, and the language of the court was Turkish, and you can read his memoirs. He wrote his memoirs in Turkish, but Turkish was not a language, a respected language of scholarship or poetry. And so initially, the language used in the court, the official language of the court, and of the dynasty was Persian, an Iranian language. Persian was considered a respectable secular language. Of course, when it came to religious matters, as Muslims, everything had to be in Arabic. I mean, the Quran, the Holy Book of Islam, had to be read in Arabic. That was required. That was the only way you could learn it. And all religious scholarship had to be in Arabic. But of course, when it came to poetry and secular work and the language of the court, it was Persian. Now, over time, though, you had a situation where even the rulers, the ruling class, and the dynasty of the Mughals, over time they came to speak the language spoken by the vast majority of the inhabitants, Hindustani, which is one of the most even spoken today in India. It's one of the most common languages, biggest spoken languages in the world, besides Han, Chinese, and English. So what they did is they decided they had to create instead of using Persian as the language of the court, they needed to develop a new written script. Now, the traditional script for Hindustani was Sanskrit, and that was closely linked with the Hindu religion. So they couldn't use that script because that would be a nod to Hindu religion. So they had to develop their own writing system that was based on Persian and Arabic, and it's called Urdu. To this day, the written language of Pakistan in the north is Urdu. So it was a script developed specifically by the Mughal dynasty so that they could have their own written language that was not tainted by, like Sanskrit, with an association with a pagan religion, Hinduism. So that's how the Mughal dynasty came to be founded by Babur. Now, the greatest Mughal ruler was a man by the name of Akbar. You can see his picture there up here. Akbar, you can see his dates there. He would have been a contemporary of Philip II of Spain and Queen Elizabeth of England. It was under his reign that the Mughal dynasty reached its greatest extent. It was under Akbar that the empire of the Mughal Empire came to include almost all of what is today India. In addition, it included Pakistan and even parts of Afghanistan. So it was a very extensive empire under Akbar. Now, he was a traditional Muslim ruler, and like his predecessors, he felt the obligation to fight jihad, to wage war against the enemies of Islam, to spread Islamic law, Sharia law, around the world. And early on in his reign, he was a great conqueror. And for example, he brought almost all of India under control by conquering one of the last independent Hindu states in India, I can't even spell it, say it, the Vijayanagara Empire, the second one. The inhabitants of southern India, extreme southern India, they don't speak Hindustani, which is an Indo-European language. They speak a language called Tamil, and it's a very ancient language. It's non-Indo-European. It probably was the indigenous language of India going back thousands of years. But in the Tamil people, like the rulers of this empire, they had embraced Hinduism. They had their own kind of version of Hinduism. So they worshiped the same gods as Hindus who spoke Hindustani, but they had their own take on these ancient myths and traditions. But they were Hindus, and the Tamil Empire had roots and they had trade links with Indonesia and Java, and they were the last great Hindu empire that was independent. Now, it was to Akbar's credit that he waged war against this empire, and he even bragged about it. Early on in his reign, he was very happy that he had killed 40,000 infidels. He had slaughtered the infidels and defeated these pagans and brought and spread Islam, and he was very proud of that fact early on in his reign. So he had great success in expanding the Mughal Empire. Now, as he got older, though, Akbar had a kind of a religious experience. I don't know what it was, but he decided that there was something to other religions other than Islam. And all of a sudden he became very tolerant For example, he lifted all the heavy taxes imposed on Hindus, so that they didn't have to pay these heavy taxes anymore. He also lifted the ban on the construction of Hindu temples. He said, "Oh, I don't care. They want to build temples, that's great, no problem." So, and all of a sudden, he became very much loved by the Hindus, because they went from being people who were subjected to heavy taxes and couldn't build temples to being allowed full religious freedom and the ability to build temples. They loved this guy. He became the ruler of all Indians, both Muslim and Hindu. He also was very open, receptive to other religions. He even allowed Jesuit and Protestant evangelists into his court, welcomed him to his court. He liked to hear the Islamic scholars debate with the Christians about everything. So he became very open-minded and listened. And he came to embrace this idea that there was this one God over all society, that the Hindus and the Christians and the Muslims all worshipped a single God. And he even adopted some of the practices of Hinduism. Here he is, a Muslim ruler, and he became a vegetarian, which was common among Hindus. He didn't eat any meat anymore. Now, this kind of transformation of Akbar was something that was going on in India at this time among a lot of both Hindus and Muslims. A much younger contemporary, and I think Akbar would have just been a boy when he died, was a man by the name of Nanak Dev Ji. Now, Guru is his title, which means teacher. Now, Nanak Dev Ji is considered to be the founder of the Sikh religion. Now, Sikhs was a religion that was born in India, or developed in India, and it's a monotheistic religion, and they believe that there is just one God, so it's like Islam in that respect. But they follow many traditional Hindu practices like vegetarianism. And they also believe in reincarnation, which is also a Hindu idea. So it's kind of a syncretic religion that combines elements of Islam with elements of Hinduism. And so what was going on in Akbar's mind was something that was going on in India. And there you see the birth of a whole new religion. Now, for Sikhs, the title Guru is an honorary title given to great teachers. And Guru Nanak Dev Ji was the founder of this Sikh religion. A lot of times Sikhs get confused today with Muslims, because Sikh men are required to wear a turban, and so a lot of times people see a turban, and there was a case a couple of years ago of some crazy guy who opened fire on a Sikh temple because he said they were Muslims, and they're not they're not Muslims at all. I mean, they have their own religion. They're Sikhs. Now, a lot of times in Pakistan today, some Muslims in Pakistan consider Sikhs to be heretics, and so Sikhs are subject to a lot of attacks in Pakistan, where most of them live, and that's why a lot of Sikhs have come to this country to live, because here they don't have to worry about getting beaten up or attacked by Islamic extremists like they do in their native Pakistan. All right. So I just wanted to mention that this kind of development, this kind of world in which Muslims and Hindus are sharing ideas and living together, this promoted the development of a whole new religion, the Sikh religion. Now, the state that was established by Akbar, though, it's under its later rulers, it kind of began to decline. And the successors of Akbar weren't nearly as good at holding this empire together. For example, Shah Jahan, who was in the middle of the 17th century, he was the Mughal Shah. A lot of times the word Shah, which is a Persian word for king, was used to describe the Mughal dynasty rulers. But he was Shah Jahan was the Shah, the ruler of the Mughal dynasty, and he was more devoted to building luxurious palaces than he was to ruling. I mean, he created great art. I mean, Delhi, the capital, old, you can, tourists still go there to see the palace and some of the great works of art. And probably one of the greatest works of art that was created was the Taj Mahal. Anybody heard of the Taj Mahal? Probably heard of that. It's probably one of the most photographed buildings in the world. It actually was built as a mausoleum. He built it in honor of his wife. His wife died giving birth to, I don't know how many kids. I think they had
15.
What?
15.
I don't know,
They're
15.
now.
They had lots of kids, and she died giving birth to the last one. And Shah Jahan was very devoted to his wife, so he decided to honor his wife with this one of the most beautiful, most expensive buildings ever created. In fact, even to this day, in India, it's a tradition for newlyweds to go to the Taj Mahal. And so that's why it's a big tourist for Indians go there. Like it used to be a tradition for newlyweds to go to Niagara Falls here in this country. In India, newlyweds go to or Hawaii. In India, newlyweds go to visit the Taj Mahal. But it's fine building a beautiful mausoleum to your wife, but that means that if you're devoting all that time and resources to a beautiful mausoleum, you're not spending as much time and resources on like an army, and the army was what held this empire together. You see, it was an empire that was created by force and by conquest, and it's hard to hold an empire together if you don't have an adequate, efficient, and powerful army to hold it together. Now, by the time you get to Shah Jahan, what was happening is that the Mughal rulers were granting more and more autonomy and independence to their governors. The term Nawab is a term that means like honorary governor. It's a term of, it's like a duke or a count. It's an honorary title. And what was happening is that as the central government became more and more ineffective and weak, and the central army became weaker, more and more local governors, or nawabs, were assuming more and more independence and developing independent states. So over time, what was happening was that the Mughal emperor, the Mughal Shah, the ruler, was becoming less and less powerful, and local nawabs, or provincial governors, were exercising more autonomy and independence. And that also applied to the Rajputs. A Nawab would be a Muslim governor that was independent. A Rajput would be a Hindu governor that would be independent. So Rajputs and Nawabs were more and more establishing and carving out their own kind of independent principalities out of what had formerly been the Mughal Empire. Now, you still had a Mughal emperor, a Mughal Shah running the show, but their power and influence was declining steadily. Now, what created a big commotion and created lots of problems for the Mughal dynasty was the reign of Aurangzeb. See, I can't pronounce these words at all. But anyway, now he reigned from 1658 to 1707, and the thing about him was that when he came to the throne, he also had a religious experience, kind of like Akbar. But his religious experience was that he needed to get back to what he considered to be real Islam. And that meant that he wanted to make sure that all the Hindus that he ruled converted to Islam. So he ordered, he wanted to restore what he thought was a pure form of Islam. So he ordered that all the Hindu temples be shut down and destroyed. And he reinstated the real heavy poll tax. And any Hindus who got in his way, he ordered them to be executed. Now, the fact of the matter is that by the time you get to Aurangzeb, the army of Aurangzeb was not the army of Babur. And the Hindus had been accustomed to almost a century of religious freedom. So the Hindus did not sit down quietly and take these new government programs. They didn't accept the heavy tax and the destruction of their temples and the abolition of their religion. And so Aurangzeb had to deal with a lot of rebellions. And that meant that he had to spend more time crushing rebellions than holding his empire together. So the net result of Aurangzeb's rule was that by the time he died in 1707, the Mughal dynasty was even weaker. and its hold on the Nawabs was even less strong. So he really, by trying to kind of reinstate the old order and what he saw as a pure Islam, what he did was, in the long run, kind of bring about the near collapse of his dynasty, the Mughal dynasty. Now, a real blow to the legitimacy of the Mughal dynasty occurred in 1739. 1739, the Mughal dynasty went to war against the Shah of Iran, the Shah of Persia. And it didn't go well for India. The Shah of Iran, the Persian ruler, invaded India, and in 1739, Delhi was sacked. I mean, the capital was burned to the ground, and much of its wealth was looted. Now, the Persians didn't stick around. The Persian ruler, who we'll talk about a little later, he went back home to Afghanistan, where he was born, and but he left a lot of destruction in his wake. So after this sack of 1739, that was like a fatal last blow to the Mughal dynasty. After 1739, there still was a ruler, a Mughal ruler in Delhi, but his rule, his actual power, did not extend beyond the borders of Delhi. Pretty much, he was recognized as Shah, but the Nawabs and Rajputs were, by that time, completely independent and running their respective states pretty much independently with full autonomy. From that point onward, the Mughal dynasty was just a shell of its former self, a shadow. Now, by the time we get to the 18th century, though, a new power had emerged in India, and that would be the British. The British arrived in India as traders, as merchants. Remember, we talked about the Age of Discovery, and talked about how the Europeans were exploring the New World. Well, it wasn't just the New World they were exploring. They were the Dutch, the British, the French, were also the Portuguese, were also opening up trade routes and trade centers with India and Indonesia and China. We already saw it when we talked about China. Well, in Indonesia, for example, the Dutch early on established themselves and established their control over much of what is today the island of Java. In fact, by the 19th century, the Dutch pretty much dominated all the islands of Indonesia and had made it their own. Now, the British did the same thing in India. Now, when the British arrived, trade with India was controlled by a single company. Queen Elizabeth of England gave, in 1601, she chartered the British, well, it was just called the East India Company. It wasn't British yet. It was just called the East India Company, was chartered by Queen Elizabeth in 1601. And it was called what we call a joint stock company. In other words, it was like it's the predecessor of the modern corporation. People could buy stocks and buy ownership in this company. And the East India Company, a lot of gentry and merchants invested large amounts of money in the East India Company because it controlled all trade with India. And that was a lot of trade because India had silks and spices and precious metals and precious stones, and there was a lot of luxury goods, tea. There were a lot of luxury goods coming out of India. So the British East India Company became one of the wealthiest companies in the world because it had this monopoly of trade with the East. Now as we'll see, this is kind of a sad thing. By the 19th century, it made a lot of money off this. It was one of the biggest drug traffickers in the world. Opium that was raised in Afghanistan and Pakistan and India was sold to China, and that's how by the 19th century, that was a major source of revenue for the British East India Company, was selling opium to the Chinese. And in fact, Americans were involved too. You know, the grandfather of Franklin Delano Roosevelt, his name was Delano. That's where you get the Delano and Franklin Delano Roosevelt. He was a drug trafficker. So one of America's greatest presidents, his family made their fortune as drug traffickers. You know, and so there's a certain dignity in drug trafficking, don't you think? But anyway, but that's how they made their money. So they made a lot of money selling things that were produced in India. Now, early on, they what they did was they established trading posts in India, and they would get local rulers, local nawabs, to give them the authority to establish these outposts, these trading outposts in India. Like, for example, Madras was established as a trading post in 1639, and that's where the British East India Company operated. Now, it was called a factory. That's what they called it, but it really wasn't a factory in the sense that they weren't mass producing goods like we think of a factory. Factory was just a term used to describe these trading posts that were established by the British East India Company. Another one that was Bombay, established in 1668. Bombay is now Mumbai. They changed the name. So Mumbai and Bombay are the same place. It's one of the emerging tech capitals in the world. It's where they make I think Bollywood's located there, where they make Indian movies. But anyway, but these were originally British factories, British outposts for the British East India Company. Now, the British East India Company, they were able to strengthen their trade agreements. They would establish trade agreements with the Nawabs and Rajputs, these principalities in India. And a lot of times it's really important if you're making a trade deal if you have some kind of force behind you. They needed some way of, in their negotiations, of maybe threatening their opponents, to give them leverage in the negotiations. So what the British did was they began a program of training local Indians to fight in the British and European methods of fighting. They were called sepoys. Here's a sepoy here. You got this. This is a Sikh sepoy. You can see the picture here. He's got his gun. He's got his Sikh hat on, his turban. Sikhs are often the ones who were recruited to fight as sepoys by the British East India Company. Sikhs, but also Muslims, Hindus. They didn't care. But the thing was that the sepoys were trained in the European style of fighting, using guns. Their officers were usually officers from the British Army. So the British Army officers would be recruited to serve as captains of the sepoys. But the sepoys gave the British East India Company, they gave them the leverage in negotiations because they gave them a military force at their disposal so that they could make pretty good deals. Now, it was a two-way street here because these Nawabs and Rajputs, they benefited from British manufactured goods, especially guns and iron weapons and tools and pottery, and so it was a two-way trading agreement. Now, by the 18th century, the British East India Company, with its sepoys, was probably the strongest force in India. But they had rivals. Early on in the 17th century, the Dutch had been a big rival. And by the close of the 17th century, the Dutch had pretty much removed themselves from India and focused their efforts on consolidating their position in Indonesia and Southeast Asia. So, but by the 18th century, still, the French were a major rival. See, the French had their own companies and their own factories and their own influence and their sepoys in India as well. So the only real competitor to British domination over the region came from the French. So that's why we talked about this when we talked about the 7 Years' War. You see, the British public, remember in the way the British worked, the British system worked, was that Parliament was in charge. Remember, under King George and King George II, they were Germans and they didn't really give themselves much involvement in the affairs of Great Britain. So in Great Britain, the Parliament pretty much called the shots. And the Parliament included lots of investors in the British East India Company. Remember, the British East India Company was one of the wealthiest companies in the world. And a lot of gentry and wealthy merchants, the people who voted and held office in Parliament, they also were investors in the British East India Company. Later on, this, if you know your American history, one of the reasons why there was the Tea Party, the Boston Tea Party in 1773, was because Parliament passed a law that gave the British East India Company the ability to sell tea directly to the Americans. Basically, it was what we would call crony capitalism today. The Parliament gave a special deal to the British East India Company to sell cheap tea to the American colonists at a reduced price, and American merchants were angry that they felt like the British East India Company was given this special treatment that they weren't given, and they had to pay these taxes, and the British East India Company didn't have to pay these taxes, and that's why you had the Boston Tea Party in 1773. But anyway, I digress. But I mention that example because the British East India Company, because of its wealth and because so many of the British ruling class were invested in it, it had a lot of say in how the British policies. So that's why during the 7 Years' War, remember when the French were allied with the Habsburgs of Austria, the British allied themselves with with Prussia, because from their point of view, any enemy of France was their friend. And during the 7 Years' War, between 1756 and 1763, the British focused most of their efforts on defeating the French in India, but also in North America. And remember, it's called the French and Indian War in North America. And ultimately, the British were successful. And a lot of the reasons for their success was because of banking. See, the British, this is a great story, the British had created, in 1707, the British created the Bank of England. And the Bank of England was just, and it was an official bank, but it was chartered by the British government, but it was open to private investors, you see. And the way it worked is that the Bank of England would buy bonds in the British government. See, William Pitt, the Prime Minister during the 7 Years' War, he wanted to really strengthen the banks, strengthen the army, strengthen the Navy, because he wanted to win this war. He's called the father of the British Empire because it was his vision of British domination in North America, British domination in India, and he needed the fleet and he needed the military force to do that. So how did he do that? He borrowed a lot of money. So he went to the Bank of England, which had been created back in 1707, and said, look, Bank of England, we need some money. I'm going to sell you a bunch of bonds. A bond is when a government goes into debt. They sell bonds. So the Bank of England bought up all these bonds. Now you got to remember this. This is all linked together. The Bank of England included investors. The investors were Englishmen. The same investors who were in the Bank of England owned stock in the British East India Company. See how those all go together? So if you're an English gentleman, say you're an Englishman, you have money to spend, you're a merchant or you're a landowner, you have money to invest, you're going to invest in the Bank of England and you're going to invest in the British East India Company. And now the Bank of England is lending money to the British government to expand the British Empire in India. So you can't lose, because the British, you see, if you're a British investor, you got your money in the Bank of England, right? You're going to get your money back from the government revenue, and the government is building up money and building up its armed forces so it can wage war in India and expand the interests of the British East India Company. So if you're an investor in the Bank of England and an investor in the British East India Company, you can't lose. The British upper class, they were going to make lots of money. Now the difference between the Bank of England and, let's say, the way we pay our debts right now, you see, the Bank of England was fully funded by British investors. British investors were putting money in the Bank of England, and the Bank of England was loaning money to the British government. The difference in our situation is the Chinese government and the Japanese government are funding our debt. You see the difference? Now, it used to be, up until World War II, that American investors were the ones buying American bonds and paying for our debt. So we had American investors paying for our debt because they were the ones buying American bonds. But that's not the case anymore. Now we have China and Japan and Korea paying for our debt. See, that's the difference. Now, in this case, the British were doing what the Americans used to do. British investors were paying for the Bank of England, right? The Bank of England to lend money to the British government so they could build up their armed forces and then use those armed forces to defeat the French and advance the interests of the British East India Company. And that's what they were doing. So that's why eventually the British forces were victorious. And another thing about William Pitt, another thing, reason for success besides his realizing that borrowing lots of money can be a good thing if you're going to invest it wisely, is that when it came to positions in the military and in the Navy, he based it on talent, not just on who your father was. He learned, I mean, that's what Frederick the Great did. That's what Peter the Great did. You know, you had to be a member of the gentry to be a British officer. That's true. You had to be a member of the upper class to be a British officer. But he picked the officers based on their talent and ability. So he created a very talented staff of military commanders who were instrumental in leading British forces to victory. And one of the great heroes of the British war in India and the victory over the French was Lord Cornwallis. And if you know your American history, he was one of the commanders of the British forces during the American Revolutionary War. Now, all these wars are linked because this is interesting. Remember I told you how William Pitt and the British government went into huge debt to build up their armed forces, to win the war in India, to defeat the French in India, defeat the French in North America. One of the reasons why they started imposing new taxes on the American colonists after the war was over was to pay off that debt. And that would be one of the causes of the American Revolutionary War. But anyway. Now another thing, notice this is another thing. America's a great country, and I love America, but this is, like I told you how we go into debt by borrowing from French and from Chinese and Japanese and Korean. We're going to debt, and foreign countries are paying for it. You know when we did all those? Remember when we saved all the banks in 2008? Mm-hmm. Most of our money went to foreign banks. We saved foreign banks. I mean, so like not only are taxpayer dollars being used to enrich Chinese investors, but we saved the banks of other countries. so it's like we're doing the opposite of the British. At least the British upper class in the 18th century realized, hey, let's do what we can. We're going to make a lot of money, so let's help ourselves. So that's why they funded the Bank of England. They funded the British East India Company. They went to war because all that money went to Great Britain. It went into their pockets. Now, it didn't help like the lower class peasants working in England. Obviously, they weren't going to benefit from all this. But if you were a middle class or upper class Englishman, these wars and these debts paid off in the sense that they expanded trade and commerce and opportunities for the British, for the English, in the 18th century. So by the close of the 7 Years' War, by 1763, the British, via the British East India Company, had established themselves as the most powerful state in India. And now the Mughal dynasty would continue to exist until 1857, and we'll talk about how the British eventually got rid of that dynasty and established formal control after 1857. All right, but we'll do that later. So that's India. All right, now we're going to talk about another country that's very important in history, and it's in the news a lot, and that would be Iran. The Persian language, Persian is an Iranian language, was one of the great vehicles for secular literature, poetry, and history, because so many, not only Iranians, but Turks adopted the Persian as their, like we saw with the Mughal dynasty. So Iran is one of the important, like China, like Japan, it's one of the great nations of the world in influencing and shaping not only Iranians, but their neighbors. So that's why we spend a lot of time, we're going to spend some time looking at Iran, because they're such a force in Western Asia and Central Asia in this period. But we've gone for quite a while here. Why don't we take a break for about a couple minutes, and then we'll finish up. So we'll take a little break now, about 3 or 4 minutes. All right, now we're going to talk about Iran. Now, in the early part of this period, the empire, the Safavid Empire, is another one of what we sometimes call the gunpowder empire. It's like the empire that Babur, the Mughal dynasty, it was built on this new technology of using guns. Like the Janissaries in the Ottoman Empire used the same thing. It was this new technology instead of the steppe horsemen. It's a new way of fighting, and it was another empire built on infantry and muskets, guns. Now, the Safavid Empire, it's named after a man named Safi. Who was Safi? Safi was a Sufi. I just like saying that. Safi the Sufi. Now, what's a Sufi? Now, a Sufi in Islam, a Sufi in Islam is a spiritual leader. In Islam, there are certain people who are believed to be, because they're so pious and to have these kind of mystical experiences where they experience God directly. So a Sufi is kind of like they're not prophets because they don't predict the future so much, but they have a direct connection to God. They have this kind of mystical experience where they are united for a moment with God. And so their disciples, people who follow their teachings, kind of have this great reverence for them. And now in some purists, like Al-Qaeda purists, think that Sufism is non-Islamic. So for some Muslims, like in the form of Islam practiced in Saudi Arabia today, or they're called Safavists, or for some Islams, Sufis are regarded as heretics, and it's because they don't believe that anybody can achieve a mystical unity with God. So, but Safi was a Sufi who lived in the 14th century, and he was Turkish. He lived in what is today northern Iran, but it was a part of northern Iran that had been settled over time by large numbers of Turks. Let me show you. If you look on a map, you can see over here, this is the Caspian Sea, and just to the south of the Caspian Sea, in this region right here, a lot of this area, going back to the 12th century, was settled by Turkish immigrants coming from Central Asia and just settling. Like Azerbaijan, which is right here, is largely people who are of Turkish and Iranian ancestry. So you have Iranians and Turks mixing together and living in the southern shore of the Caspian Sea, and that was where Safi the Sufi lived. All right. Now, what Safi the Sufi did when he died, by his time he died in 1334, he had attracted a lot of Turkish Ghazis. Now, we talk about Turkish Ghazis. Now, Ghazis are young men who decide to devote their lives to Islam, and a lot of times they're warriors. But it's not just about being a warrior. It's about living a life in accordance with the teachings of the Quran. So it's you deny yourself the pleasures of this life. You work. You are humble. You live your life according to the principles of the Quran, which are pretty much identical with the Ten Commandments for the most part. But these Ghazis these young men devoted to Islam, many of them became the disciples of Safi. And so when Safi died, they transferred their allegiance to his descendants. So over time, there was a whole bunch of Ghazi Turkish warriors who were devoted to the family of Safi. And so the descendants of Safi were called the Safavids. That was the name of the family. Now, by the time you get to the 16th century, the Safavids had become Shiite Muslims. All right, so let's talk about Shiite Muslims a little bit. Now, ever since the 7th century, since shortly after the death of the Prophet Muhammad, Muslims had split into two divisions, two sects. One of them was the Sunni Muslims, which is sometimes translated as Orthodox Muslims, and And Sunni Muslims are, the vast majority of Muslims today are Sunni Muslims. Now, Shiite Muslims were originally the followers of Ali, and who was, there was a civil war about who would be the next caliph in the 7th century. But over time, the Shiite Muslims developed their own unique doctrines and teachings. And over time, there developed a variety of Shiite denominations. If you were to compare them with Christianity, you might think of the Sunnis as Catholics and the Shiites as Protestants, in the sense that the Shiites are divided up into a number of different denominations or sects. Now, the particular version of Shiite Islam that was embraced by the Safavids, by these Turkish followers of Safi the Sufi, was called Twelvers. 12ers, that's the name, it's called Twelvers. Because they believe that there were 12 divinely inspired imams. An imam is a leader of the faith. But there were 12 imams that who lived from the 7th to the 9th century A.D. who were inspired by God. Now, see, one of the differences between Sunni and Shiites is that, you see, Sunnis believe that God revealed himself through the Quran and then the Hadith, which are the traditions of the Prophet Islam. And that's it. But Shiites believe that these imams had direct connection with God. That God revealed his will to them. And so their teachings are on par with the Quran and the traditions of the Prophet. So it's kind of like, you know how if you're a Mormon, you believe that the Book of Mormon is in addition to the Old and New Testament, the revealed Word of God. Shiites believe kind of like that. They believe that these imams revealed more to human beings. God revealed more to them through the revelations to these 12 imams. Now, some Shiites are Sixers. They only believe there are 6 imams. But this religion believes there's 12 imams. Now, this is where it gets interesting. Now, they believe that the 12th imam, the last of these imams, never died. They came to believe that the 12th imam was occulted. He was hidden. To this day, Twelvers believe that the 12th imam lives in a well in Qom, Iran. He lives under the ground. He's waiting there. He's waiting there. What is he waiting for? Of course he's waiting for the return of Jesus. Jesus is going to come back. Now, the Jesus who's going to come back in Shiite Islam, he's a badass Jesus. He's going to come and kill all the non-believers. He's going to have his sword, and he's going to wipe out and kill all non-Muslims. He's going to destroy the great Satan, the United States. He's going to destroy the lesser Satan, Israel. And he is going to, that's what they believe today. So this Jesus is going to come back. They call him Jesus. They don't believe he's the Son of God. They call him Jesus, Son of Mary. They believe in the virgin birth, but they don't know who his dad was. It wasn't God, though. He just married. So he's Jesus, son of Mary, the great prophet. He's going to come back. He's going to kill all the non-Muslims. And then the 12th imam will reemerge from the ground. He'll come from the ground and establish universal peace and love for all humanity. Of course, all the ones who haven't been killed for not being non-believers. So there's going to be a universal peace and love and everything. When the Mahdi, that's what he's called, the 12th imam, comes out of the ground and establishes his universal kingdom with Jesus there right at his side. Now some people in Iran today believe that if they start a nuclear war and start this nuclear war, that will bring back the Mahdi. And that will bring a return to worldwide peace, not return, but worldwide peace, a millennium of peace and love and everything. So that's what, waging war in the United States, the great Satan, will bring about the return of the Mahdi and the return of Jesus. The millennium will come. So there are many devout Shiite Iranians who believe this stuff. But it all goes back to the fact that the Safis, Safi and his followers, believe this. They came to believe in 12er Shiite Islam. Now, Now, in 1501, the current descendant of Safi was a young man named Ishmael. And he had at his beck and call an army of Turkoman Ghazis, Turkoman warriors. And in the name of Shiite Islam, they began a war. They had guns, and they were able to conquer much of what is today the nation of Iran. Much of the borders of Iran were established with the Safavid Empire after 1501. The funny thing was about Ishmael was that he was kind of a flake. So basically, he wasn't really even that particularly religious, but he was a descendant of Safi. So that's why he had the solid, loyal support of all these Turkoman warriors fighting at his side and going into battle and winning victories. Now, when it was all said and done, what happened is that the Turkoman warriors who had led the charge and led the wars, they were all appointed as governors over the different parts of Iran. So they, in effect, became like the ruling class. So they were of Turkish ancestry. They were Turks, but they ruled over Iranians. Now, Iranians spoke a number of dialects. When we think of Iranians, it's important to remember that not all Iranians spoke the same language. They spoke different dialects, like the same way that Dutch is different than German, and English is different than Dutch. Iranian language are kind of like that. They're all related. They're very closely related, but they're different. So different regions of Iran spoke their own kind of dialect of Iranian. Persian is a dialect of Iranian dialect that became the literary language of most of Iran. It became the official secular language of the court of the Safavids. And just like Persian was the language of the court of the Mughal dynasty, at least at the beginning. Now, when the thing about the empire that was established by Ismail and the Safavids was that one component of was it having these Turkoman warriors being the ruling class and governing the provinces. Another key aspect of it was that they continued to support and increase the power of the Shiite clerics. Okay, now I need to do some background here for you. In Islam, you don't have priests. You don't have a ministry like you do in your mainstream Christianity. You don't have that, but you do have learned scholars. And sometimes the word used is cleric to describe these scholars. These are scholars who are devoted to Sharia law. Sharia is the law of Islam. Sharia law is based on the Quran and the traditions of the Prophet Muhammad. And it's like the idea is that in an Islamic state, Sharia law would be the basis of the legal system. And a cleric, these are people who devote their whole lives. They go to a school, an Islamic school. They learn Arabic because you have to read the law and the Quran in Arabic, and they become Islamic scholars. And whenever there's any kind of issue involving family or law, sometimes you call in an Islamic scholar to interpret the law and to act as a judge. Also, these clerics are often asked to give a sermon. On Fridays, which is the holy day for Muslims. On Friday, when they go to the mosque for worship, often a distinguished cleric, an expert in law, will be asked to give the sermon and to lecture on that lesson from the Quran for that day, in the same way that a pastor does a sermon in a Christian church. Now, collectively, these lawyers were called the ulama. Now, the Sunni Muslims have their own traditions of Sharia law that are quite different than Shiite Muslims. So, in the case of Iran, you had a Shiite ulama rather than a Sunni. Now, this is the thing about Muslim clerics. It's not a hereditary position, but it often becomes one, in the sense that, like, if your father is a cleric, of course he wants his son to follow in his footsteps. So basically, a lot of times, being a member of the ulama, being a cleric, is a hereditary status, in the sense that fathers will make sure that their sons get this education so that they can be clerics but it's open to anybody. A lot of times, like wealthy merchants or wealthy farmers who want their sons, for example, to be great successes, they will sacrifice so that their son can get the proper education, go to the proper school, the Islamic school, and get that education, and then go to a university and learn about Islamic law, and then become a member of the ulama themselves. So the ulama is open to new members all the time. It's open to new members, but it's but usually it's a hereditary class. And one way to think of them is to think of them as, remember we talked about the Chunzu in China, the scholar gentleman? Well, in Iran, these Shiite clerics became very important in the life. Every village had a local cleric, and they became people that people went to for advice. They were like the local leaders, and they were very important in keeping order. And basically, under the Safavids, these Shiite clerics were also recruited to serve as officials and judges of the empire. So they became part of the ruling system and held in high regard by the local, by the population, by the residents of the empire. And so that's important to remember. So Iran, due to the Safavids, Iran became one of the few nations in the world where the majority of the people were Shiite Muslims as opposed to Sunni Muslims. And a lot of that had to do with the work of the Safavid Empire and the long-term influence of these Shiite clerics. Even today, that's true of clerics. Like fathers follow sons, like during the Iraq War, one of the biggest leaders in Iraq was his father. The only reason why he was held in any regard by Shiites was because his father was a famous cleric. Sadr was his name. He was a big opponent of the United States, and the Shiite militias attacked U.S. soldiers back in 2006. But his only claim to fame was that he was a Shiite cleric whose dad had been a famous Shiite cleric. So they still think that same way. This was in Iraq, not Iran. But Iran and southern Iraq are both Shiite nations in the sense the majority of the population are Shiites rather than Sunnis. Now, one thing that was clear was that during much of the Safavid Empire, they were major rivals of the Ottoman Empire. You see, the Ottoman Empire was Sunni, and the Ottoman Sultan regarded himself as the true caliph, the successor of the Prophet Muhammad. And they regarded the Shah of Iran, the Safavid, as a heretic because they were Shiite. And in fact, they fought a lot of wars against each other. One of the current recurring themes of this period was that in what is today the Caucasus, and what is today Georgia and Ossetia, and the Caucasus region between the Caspian and the Black Sea, that was a constant battle between the Ottoman Empire and the Safavid Empire. They also fought over Iraq. There was a big battle because much of southern Iraq was considered to be the holy land for Shiite Muslims. The holiest cities of Shiite Islam are located in southern Iraq, and so that's why there was a lot of battles between the Ottoman Empire and the Safavid Empire were in that area. It's interesting today that we see Shiites and Sunnis fighting right today in Syria, just like they were fighting back then. So today one of the big battles in Syria is between the Shiites, the ruling class, the dictator of Syria today is a Shiite, and he's getting support from Iranians serving in the militia and fighting for him. And then you have all these Sunni, a lot of them associated with Al-Qaeda, going there to fight. So these wars that we're seeing today in Syria between Shiites and Sunnis have a long history. But back in the 17th and 16th centuries, they were backed by empire. So the Shiites were Iranian and Safavid, and the Sunnis were Ottoman, and they were fighting for influence in these same parts of the world, in this case the Caucasus and Iraq. Now the greatest Iranian ruler was Shah Abbas the Great. See his dates there. And he would have been a contemporary of Queen Elizabeth and a little bit of Akbar. And ironically, he controlled this empire, and one reason why he held a tight ship and control over it was because he actually employed Christians and Jews as his bureaucrats. See, he wanted to hold this empire together. Iran was a vast country, lots of real estate to control, and he wanted loyal officials to collect taxes and to govern and control his armies. And so he knew that if he appointed Jews and Christians to these positions, since they were non-believers, they would owe everything to him and they would be more loyal. So he employed Europeans, Frenchmen, Englishmen, even Jews, a large number of Jews, Armenian Christians. He would employ them in his armies as his officials. And that's why, one reason why he was a successful ruler is because he had a loyal bureaucracy to do his bidding, to collect taxes and maintain a strong army and to hold his empire together. Now, the thing about these rulers was that it was hard to keep such a large empire together. And over time, the local governors began to exercise more autonomy and the empire began to weaken. Now, one of the last great conquerors in this part of the world was Nadir Shah. Now, he was actually a Pashtun. He was from what is today Afghanistan. And he was the one who pretty much destroyed the Safavid Empire. He also was the one who sacked Delhi in 1739. But you see, he didn't have much success in establishing an empire because he was Sunni. So even though he conquered Iran and ruled over Afghanistan, and Iran had a very large empire, he couldn't control Iran because he was Sunni, and the vast majority of the people of Iran were Shiites. And so that created a problem for him to stabilize and consolidate his position in Iran. Now, following his death, his empire broke up. And this man, now Agha Muhammad was his name. Agha Muhammad was actually one of the descendants of the Turkomans who had conquered Iran back during the days of Ismail. So his family, they were called the Qajars. They ruled over what is today northeastern Iran. And they were autonomous rulers. And they were one of the great families dating back to the days of the Safavid Empire. Now, Agha Muhammad, since he came from such a powerful family, his enemies had castrated him as a boy, so he was a eunuch. But he commanded the armies, even though he was a eunuch. And he adopted his nephew, Fath Ali Shah, as his heir. And what happened was that eventually Agha Muhammad was able to unite all of Iran under a Shiite dynasty, and he adopted his nephew, Fath Ali Shah, as the ruler of Iran, who was Shiite and of the Qajar family. And the first thing that Fath Ali Shah did was to adopt as his successor his son and crown prince Abbas Mirza. So by Agha Muhammad, through his conquest, and Fath Ali Shah, by adopting an heir, was able to establish a dynasty, the Qajar dynasty. Now, the Qajar family was descended from those Turkomans who had conquered Iran back in the days of the beginning of the Safavid Empire. So they were linked to the Safavid Empire in that way. But
your conference is scheduled to end in 2 minutes.
One reason why they were so successful in establishing a dynasty was that what they did is they relied on the members of their family, the extended Qajar family, for important positions. So under their empire, the highest positions of government were monopolized by the Qajar family. So that allowed them to maintain the unity of their bureaucracy to hold this empire together. Plus, they were Shiite Muslims, so like the previous dynasty, they relied on the Shiite clergy, the Shiite clerics, to support the dynasty. So they kind of continued the traditions of government that had been in place during the Safavid Empire. And that's one reason why this Qajar dynasty continued to rule Iran until the 20th century. It wasn't until 1925, actually, when this empire, this dynasty, was overthrown. So they established themselves well, just like the Ming, just like the Manchus, they established themselves well into, or at least the early part of the 20th century. So that's the story of Iran. And we're going to return to Europe and talk about these big scientific and political and industrial revolutions. We're going to start that on Thursday.
Next week is spring break, right?
Yeah, next week is spring break. Yeah.
How